sun was already up when Michael stepped out into his yard that morning. His workshop stood at the far end of the property, a sturdy metal building he had built with his own hands. It wasn't fancy, but it was solid, and inside it smelled of oil, steel, and hard work. This was his place, his pride, his livelihood. Every day, he spent hours in there repairing old cars, welding pieces of metal together, and sometimes just tinkering with projects that interested him. It was more than a building. It was his little kingdom, the place that paid his bills and gave him purpose. Michael loved working with his hands. Some men wore ties to the office. He wore thick gloves and a welding mask. The hum of machines and the sparks flying from his welder felt more natural to him than a keyboard or phone ever could. People around town respected him because he was reliable. If someone's car broke down, Michael was the one they called. A trailer hitch snapped, Michael welded it stronger than before. But there was one thing that always spoiled his peace: the HOA. His neighborhood had a homeowners association. And Michael had learned quickly that they loved making rules and fines out of thin air. Most of the board members kept to themselves. But one woman stood out: Karen. She seemed to have made it her life's mission to make his harder. She complained about the sound of tools, even though Michael only worked during the day. She complained about cars parked in his driveway, even when they belonged to customers who were dropping things off. She even complained once that the smell of welding was lowering the property value. Well, Michael knew that was nonsense. Michael tried to ignore her most of the time. He didn't like conflict, and he believed if he just focused on his work, eventually she'd get tired of bothering him. But Karen never got tired. She was the kind of person who got energy from making other people miserable. That particular morning started like any other. Michael grabbed a mug of coffee, walked across the yard, and slid open the workshop door. But the moment he stepped inside, he froze. Sitting right there, in the middle of his workspace, was a shiny white SUV. At first he thought maybe one of his customers had dropped it off overnight. That wasn't unusual. Sometimes people left vehicles there if they couldn't come by during the day. But then he noticed something. The car wasn't broken down. It wasn't waiting for repairs. It was perfectly fine. The keys weren't even left with him. It was just parked. Michael stared for a long moment, trying to make sense of it. Who would drive into his private workshop and just leave their car there? He walked around the SUV, looking for a note, maybe a phone number. Nothing. It was just sitting there like it belonged. Then he noticed the little decal in the back window. HOA parking permit. His stomach sank. He already knew who this belonged to: Karen. Sure enough, less than an hour later, she came strutting across the yard in her usual way. Sunglasses perched on her head like a crown. "Oh, good, you found it," she said casually, as if nothing was out of the ordinary. Michael frowned. "Why is your car in my workshop?" Karen waved her hand like it was a silly question. "The community parking spaces are always full, and my driveway is too narrow. Your workshop isn't being used all the time, so I figured why not? It's community property anyway." Michael blinked at her. "Community property? Oh, no. This is my workshop. It's on my deed. You can't just park your car in here." Karen gave him that smirk he hated, the one that always made him feel like she thought she was smarter than everyone else. "Well, technically, since you're part of the HOA, everything in the neighborhood falls under the same rules." An HOA. Rules say we can't block the street or park overnight in certain areas. So really, I'm doing the responsible thing by keeping my vehicle out of the way. Michael's jaw clenched. "This isn't a public garage. This is my property. You need to move it." She tilted her head and pretended to think. I'll consider it. But for now, I'm running late. Don't worry, I'll grab it later." With that, she turned on her heel and walked away, leaving him standing there speechless. Michael couldn't believe the nerve of her. He had dealt with her complaints before, but this was different. This was trespassing. He thought about calling the police right then, but he hesitated. He didn't want to escalate things so quickly. Maybe she really would move it later. Maybe this was a one-time thing, but of course it wasn't. The next morning, the SUV was still there. In fact, Karen had adjusted its position, parking it even deeper inside the workshop, right where Michael usually set up his welding projects. He found her outside watering her plants and confronted her again. "Karen, you can't keep doing this. I need my workshop. I have jobs scheduled this week. Customers are counting on me." She shrugged, "Then work around it. You've got plenty of space. Besides, what's one car? It's not hurting anyone." Michael wanted to shout at her, but he forced himself to stay calm. "It's hurting me. This is how I make my living." Karen gave him a sweet, fake smile. "Maybe you should consider finding another place to do all that noisy work. A neighborhood like this isn't really suited for industrial activity." Don't you think that's when Michael realized the truth? She wasn't just being careless. She was doing this on purpose. She wanted to push him out, to make his life so miserable that he'd stop using the workshop altogether. The thought made his blood boil, but he bit his tongue. Fighting with her wasn't going to help. He decided to go to the HOA board instead. Surely they would see reason. Surely they would recognize that this was outrageous. That evening, he attended the monthly meeting. He explained the situation calmly, showing pictures of Karen's SUV inside his workshop. But instead of siding with him, the board members exchanged uncomfortable glances. Some muttered about shared community spaces. Others suggested that maybe Michael should rent a commercial space for his work. Michael felt like he was in a nightmare. They were actually considering Karen's nonsense as if it had merit. He left the meeting angrier than he had been in years. For the first time, he felt truly cornered. Back at home, he stood outside his workshop, staring at the big white SUV inside. His tools were stacked neatly along the walls. His welding table stood ready. But all of it was useless as long as that vehicle was parked in the middle. He couldn't believe he was being robbed of his own space. That night, Michael barely slept. He kept replaying the conversations in his head, Karen's smug voice, the board's dismissive comments. He knew one thing for sure. If he didn't do something, she would never stop. This wasn't just about a parking space. This was about control. And Michael wasn't the kind of man to be controlled. The next morning, Michael woke up with the same heavy feeling in his chest. He knew what he would see before he even walked out to the workshop. Sure enough, when he opened the big metal doors, Karen's shiny white SUV was still sitting there, like it owned the place. It had been parked in the exact middle of the floor again, right where he needed to set up his welding stand. The sight made his stomach twist in frustration. He tried to take a deep breath and tell himself to stay calm. Losing his temper wouldn't help. Maybe, he thought, if he just spoke to her again face to face, she would realize how serious this was for him. He walked over to her house, knocked on her door, and waited. After a minute, Karen opened it, already looking annoyed, like he had interrupted something important. "Yes," she said, crossing her arms. Michael spoke as evenly as he could. "Karen, I need you to move your car. This is my workshop. I can't work when your SUV is parked inside." Karen rolled her eyes like he was being ridiculous. "Oh, come on, Michael. Just don't be so dramatic. You've got plenty of space around it. Can't you just work on the side?" Michael shook his head. "No, I can't. I need the whole floor. I've got customers depending on me. I have jobs to finish." Karen leaned against the doorframe, smirking. "Well, maybe that's the problem. You keep treating this neighborhood like it's some kind of industrial zone. This is a residential area, you know? Not a mechanic's yard. Honestly, you should be thanking me for keeping my car inside. It looks neater than all those junky cars you bring in and out." Michael clenched his jaw. He wanted to argue, but he could see she wasn't listening. She'd already made up her mind that she was right. Finally, he said firmly, "Karen, this is not your space. You don't have the right to park there. I need you to move it today." She laughed, a short, sharp sound that made his skin crawl. "You're funny. I'll move it when I feel like it. Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got better things to do." And with that, she shut the door in his face. Michael stood there for a long moment, staring at the closed door, his fists tightening at his sides. She had no respect, not for him, not for his work, not for the simple fact that the building belonged to him. The next few days only made things worse. Every morning, Karen parked her SUV in the workshop like it was her personal garage. Sometimes she even parked it deeper inside, almost touching his welding table. Michael tried to work around it at first, dragging smaller projects to the side. But it wasn't possible. The car took up too much space. He had to cancel jobs. Customers started asking why their cars weren't ready. He didn't know how to explain that a neighbor was blocking him from working. His frustration grew heavier. Each day, he went to the HOA board again, this time demanding they do something. He brought photos of the SUV in his workshop. He even brought a copy of the deed showing that the workshop was legally his private property. But the board members barely looked at the papers. One of them cleared his throat and said, "Well, technically, all properties here are under the HOA's authority. If there's a dispute, it's really a matter of community rules." Another woman on the board added, "Maybe it would be easier if you found a commercial space to do your welding. Workshops like yours aren't really in line with the neighborhood's aesthetic." Michael's eyes widened. "Are you serious? This is my land. That building is mine. You can't just let someone park inside it and say I'm the problem." But the board didn't want conflict. He shifted in their seats and mumbled about shared responsibility and community harmony. They didn't want to stand up to Karen. She was loud, she was pushy. Most people didn't want to get on her bad side. He left the meeting furious, feeling more alone than ever. Not only was Karen against him, but now the board was refusing to help. It was like he was fighting an entire system that wanted him to give up his workshop back home. He stood in front of the building, staring at the white SUV. Its polished surface reflected the late afternoon sun. Inside, his tools sat unused, covered in dust. His welding mask hung on the wall, waiting. The whole scene felt wrong, like his world had been stolen from him one piece at a time. The neighbors started noticing too. Some of them gave Michael sympathetic looks when they passed by. A few whispered that Karen was going too far, but none of them spoke up publicly. Everyone knew Karen had a sharp tongue and wasn't afraid to use it one evening. While Michael was sitting on his porch, a neighbor named Tom walked over. He lowered his voice and said, "I saw her park in there again. You know, she's just doing this to mess with you, right?" Michael sighed. "I know, but what am I supposed to do? I went to the HOA and they don't care." Tom shook his head. "That woman thinks she owns the whole street. She's been bullying people for years. But I've never seen her pull something like this before." Michael stared out at the workshop. "She picked the wrong person this time. I'm not just going to let it go." Still, the days dragged on. Each morning, Karen's SUV sat there waiting for him, daring him to act. She strutted around the neighborhood, acting like she had one. Every time he saw her smirk, it fueled the fire inside him a little more. He was a patient man, but patience had its limits. One morning, as he tried to work on a small project outside, Karen walked past, holding her coffee cup. She glanced at him, struggling with the metal parts, and said in a cheerful voice, "Wouldn't it be easier if you had a little more room? Maybe you should rent a workshop somewhere else? I hear there are some spaces downtown." Michael didn't answer. He just looked at her, and for the first time, he didn't see a neighbor. He saw someone who had invaded his life, stolen his space, and dared to laugh about it. That was the moment he knew he couldn't keep trying to reason with her. Talking wasn't going to work. The HOA wasn't going to help. If Karen thought she could park in his workshop whenever she wanted, then maybe it was time to show her just how wrong she was. That night, Michael sat awake in his small living room, staring at the dark window. He could see the outline of the workshop from where he sat, the faint glimmer of Karen's white SUV catching the moonlight. His fist clenched every time he thought about it. It was inside his workshop, sitting in the very space where his welding sparks used to fly, where his projects used to come alive. Now, it was nothing but a cage for someone else's car. He had begged her to move it, on a tet, gone to the HOA. He had tried to reason, tried to stay calm, but nothing worked. She had laughed at him. She had mocked his work, mocked his space, treated him like he was nothing. Michael wasn't a man who liked trouble, but he was also not the kind of man who let someone walk all over him. That SUV wasn't just a car parked in a building. It was a challenge, an insult, a line in the sand. And he knew, deep down, there was only one way to take back what was his. The next morning, Karen wasn't around. Michael walked to the workshop, unlocked the doors, and looked at the SUV. The sight made his blood rush hotter. He could almost hear her smug voice in his head, telling him to work around it. He pulled the big doors all the way down until They met the floor. He locked them from the inside. Then he walked over to his welding table, pulled on his gloves, and grabbed his mask. When the torch lit up, sparks burst into the air, crackling like fireworks. The bright glow danced against the walls as Michael lowered the mask over his face. He leaned down and began welding the edges of the door shut. The sound was sharp and steady, the kind of sound that usually meant creation, fixing, or building. But this time, it was different. This time, it was the sound of payback. The smell of hot metal filled the workshop. Sparks showered onto the floor. As he moved along the edges, sealing the heavy doors shut with thick lines of molten steel, each burst of fire felt like a nail in the coffin of Karen's arrogance. She thought his workshop was community property. She thought she could just take it from him. Now she was about to learn a lesson she'd never forget. By the time he finished, sweat was dripping down his back. He pulled off the mask and looked at his work. The doors were solid, sealed tight, impossible to open from the outside without serious cutting tools. Karen's SUV was locked inside, trapped in the very space she thought she owned. Michael wiped his forehead with a rag and allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. For the first time in weeks, he felt in control. He left the workshop, closed the small side door behind him, and went about his day as if nothing had happened. He mowed his lawn. He sat on the porch with a glass of iced tea. He waved at a passing neighbor. Inside, though, he was waiting. He knew it was only a matter of time before Karen came back and saw what he had done. It didn't take long. Late that afternoon, Michael heard the sound of heels clicking down the sidewalk. He looked up just in time to see Karen striding toward the workshop, sunglasses perched on her head, keys in hand. She looked confident, almost smug, like always. She reached the doors, grabbed the handle, and yanked. Nothing happened. She frowned, pulled harder. Still nothing. Michael leaned back in his chair, sipping his tea, watching the scene unfold like a movie. Karen rattled the handles again, confusion spreading across her face. Then she noticed the dark lines of weld along the edges. Her jaw dropped. "What?" She muttered, stepping back. She ran her fingers over the hardened metal, realization dawning on her face. Her car was inside. The doors were welded shut. She spun around, her eyes narrowing on Michael. "Did you do this?" she shouted, her voice sharp enough to make a few neighbors peek out their windows. Michael set his glass down calmly and looked at her. "Did what?" he asked. "You welded the doors shut?" she screamed. "My car's in there." Michael shrugged. "Oh, I thought you said it was community property. Figured you wouldn't mind if I made some improvements." Karen's face turned red with rage. She marched toward him, pointing a finger. "You can't do this. This is illegal. You've trapped my car." Michael looked her dead in the eye and said evenly, "No, Karen. You trapped your car. You put it in my workshop without permission. Wouldn't move it when I asked. Now it's staying there until I decide otherwise." A small crowd of neighbors had started to gather across the street, whispering and pointing. They were used to Karen yelling at people, but they had never seen someone stand up to her like this. Karen stomped her foot like a child. "I'm calling the police. You're going to jail for this." Michael leaned back in his chair again. "Cool as ice? Go ahead. Call them." Karen pulled out her phone, her hands shaking with fury, and dialed. She paced back and forth as she shouted into the phone, explaining that her neighbor had welded her car inside his workshop. The neighbors exchanged amused looks, some even chuckling. When the police finally arrived, Karen ran to them like a victim. "Officer, arrest him. He locked my car inside his building. He welded the doors shut. He stole my property." It's a two. Officers looked at each other, then at Michael, who was sitting calmly on his porch. One of them approached him. "Sir, is this true? Did you weld the doors shut with her car inside?" Michael nodded. "Yes, I did. But this is my workshop. It's on my deed. She parked her car inside without my permission. I asked her to move it many times. She refused. I couldn't do my work, so I secured my building." The officer raised his eyebrows and turned back to Karen. "Ma'am, is this his property?" Karen hesitated. Well, technically, but the HOA says. The officer cut her off. Is his name on the deed? Karen sputtered. Yes, but the HOA rules say. The officer sighed. Ma'am, HOA rules don't override property ownership. If this is his building, then you had no right to park your car in there. Karen's face twisted with disbelief. So you're just going to let him keep my car locked up? That's theft? The officer shook his head. No, it's not theft. Your car isn't gone. It's right there. You just can't get to it because of your own choices. This is a civil matter, not a criminal one. We can't arrest him for securing his own property. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish. She turned red, then pale, then red again. The neighbors across the street were clearly enjoying the show. A few of them even started whispering things like, "About time someone stood up to her." Michael stayed silent, letting the officers handle it. They told Karen she would have to work it out through the HOA or the courts if she wanted her car back. Then they left, leaving her standing there trembling with rage. She spun toward Michael and screamed, "This isn't over. You'll regret this." But Michael only stood, walked to his door, and said quietly, "No, Karen, you're the one who's going to regret it." Then he stepped inside and closed the door, leaving her fuming in the yard while the neighbors chuckled behind their curtains. That night, the neighborhood buzzed with gossip. Everyone had seen it. Everyone had heard. Karen, the queen of complaints, the terror of the HOA, had finally met her match. And Michael, the quiet man who fixed cars and kept to himself, had become a sort of legend. Karen didn't sleep that night. She was too angry, too shocked, and too humiliated. Her car was locked inside Michael's workshop, sealed behind heavy doors that now glistened with thick lines of weld. The whole neighborhood had seen her screaming and calling the police, and instead of supporting her, people had laughed quietly behind their curtains. She hated that. Karen had built her entire image on being the one who controlled everything around here. She gave orders, she complained, and she expected people to obey. But now, for the first time, someone had stood against her. Worse than that, he had beaten her in front of everyone. Michael, on the other hand, slept like a baby. When he woke, the next morning, the sun was shining, the birds were singing, and his workshop stood tall and silent at the edge of the property, keeping Karen's SUV like a trophy locked inside. He stretched, poured himself a coffee, and stepped out onto the porch. A couple of neighbors walking their dogs waved at him. One of them even gave him a small thumbs up, like a secret signal of respect. Michael chuckled quietly to himself. He hadn't set out to become some kind of neighborhood hero, but he couldn't deny that it felt good knowing people were glad someone had finally stopped Karen, for too long. She had pushed everyone around, using the HOA as her weapon. Ow! Suddenly, she wasn't the one in control. Karen, of course, didn't give up so easily. She stormed around the neighborhood that morning, knocking on doors, demanding that people do something. She went from house to house, her voice raised, telling anyone who would listen that Michael had broken the law, that he had trapped her car, that he was dangerous. But most neighbors simply shrugged or pretended to be busy. A few even closed, their doors in her face. People were tired of her bullying, and deep down, some of them enjoyed seeing her finally get what she deserved. Later that day, Karen marched straight to the HOA office. She barged into the meeting room, slamming her bag onto the table. "You have to find him," she shouted before anyone even asked her to sit down. "You have to make him open those doors and release my car." The board members shifted uncomfortably. In their seats, they had heard what happened. They had even seen the police cars the night before. One man cleared his throat and said carefully, "Well, Karen, technically he does own that workshop. It's his property. There's not much we can do." Karen's face turned red. "Not much you can do?" "He welded my car inside like a prisoner. He humiliated me. He made a fool of the entire HOA." Another woman on the board side. "Karen, maybe you shouldn't have parked in his workshop in the first place." That was the first time anyone on the board had dared say something like that to her. Karen's mouth fell open in disbelief. "Are you taking his side?" she demanded. "After everything I've done for this community." But she could see it in their faces. They weren't afraid of her anymore. The tide was turning, and she hated it. She stormed out of the office, slamming the door behind her, and swore under her breath that she wouldn't let Michael win. Back at Michael's place, the situation had turned into a neighborhood spectacle. Every day people slowed down as they walked by, glancing at the welded workshop doors, whispering about Karen's trapped SUV. Some even laughed openly. A few of Michael's friends stopped by to clap him on the back and say, "That was genius." Michael didn't brag, but inside, he felt proud. He had finally stood his ground, and it felt good. Karen, meanwhile, tried everything she could think of. She called the police again, but they repeated what they had said before: it was a civil matter, not criminal. She called the fire department, claiming it was a safety hazard, but they told her unless there was an actual fire, they couldn't do anything. She even called a locksmith, but when he saw the thick lines of steel welded across the doors, he shook his head and said, "Lady, this isn't a job for me. You'll need a demolition crew to get that open." That answer only made her angrier. Hiring a crew would cost her hundreds, maybe thousands of dollars she didn't want to pay for. She wanted Michael to undo what he had done, to admit defeat, to hand her back the power she believed she deserved. One evening, she showed up at his porch again, red-faced and shaking with rage. "You think you're smart, don't you?" she snapped. "You think the whole neighborhood loves you now? But this isn't over. I'll sue you. I'll take you to court. I'll make sure you lose everything." Michael leaned back in his chair, calm as ever. "Go ahead," he said quietly. "But until a judge tells me otherwise, that workshop stays locked and your car stays inside." Karen stomped her foot, screamed in frustration, and stormed off. Michael just shook his head. By now, the story had spread beyond the neighborhood. People in nearby areas had heard about the HOA Karen who got her SUV welded inside a workshop. Michael started getting calls from friends he hadn't spoken to in years, laughing and asking if the rumors were true. Even the local mechanic stopped by just to say, "Man, I wish I'd thought of that." The more Karen fought, the worse she looked. The police wouldn't help her. The HOA was backing away. The neighbors were laughing at her. The longer her SUV sat trapped inside the workshop, the more foolish she appeared. It was like a slow-motion punishment, a constant reminder to everyone that she wasn't as powerful as she pretended to be. Still, Karen refused to admit defeat. She wrote angry letters to the HOA. She left notes on Michael's porch threatening him with lawsuits. She even tried to convince other neighbors to boycott him, to stop speaking to him, but most of them ignored her. Some even started inviting Michael over for barbecues, just to show where their loyalty lay. One afternoon, when Michael was outside trimming his hedges, Karen stood across the street, glaring at him. "You won't get away with this," she shouted suddenly. Her voice cracked, carrying across the whole block. "I'll find a way to ruin you." Michael paused, wiped sweat from his forehead, and looked at her calmly. "Karen," he said evenly, "the only person ruining you is you." That line hit harder than anything else he had said. She stood there, trembling, unable to come up with a response. Finally, she turned and stormed back into her house, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. By then, everyone could see it. Karen was losing. The woman who had once terrorized the neighborhood was unraveling. Her reputation was gone, her authority was gone, and her car was still locked away like a hostage. And Michael, he had become a symbol of quiet resistance. The man who finally stood up and said enough was enough. The fallout was bigger than Michael expected. The HOA board, embarrassed by Karen's behavior and the attention it had drawn, began changing its tone. They sent out a notice reminding residents that private property must be respected. No exceptions. For once, the rules weren't on Karen's side. Michael read the notice with a small smile. He had fought for his space and he had one. The battle wasn't over yet. Karen still had her pride, and he knew she wasn't the type to give up entirely, but the balance had shifted. She wasn't the unstoppable force anymore. She was just a woman with a welded-shut car, a ruined reputation, fewer allies than ever. For Michael, that was enough for now. He could breathe again, could feel the respect of his neighbors. As he sat on his porch that evening, sipping his coffee, he thought to himself that sometimes the best revenge wasn't shouting or fighting. Sometimes it was just a steady hand, a welding torch, and a little patience. The days that followed felt strangely quiet to Michael, the first time in weeks. He didn't wake up dreading the sight of Karen's SUV sitting proudly in his workshop, as if it belonged there. Instead, every morning he walked outside, looked at the sealed doors and felt a deep calm. The car was still inside, yes, but it wasn't a problem anymore. It was locked away, contained, no longer blocking his life. The problem had turned into a solution. Karen had given him endless trouble, and now her car had become her own prison. The neighbors had stopped whispering behind their curtains. Now, they spoke openly. Some stopped Michael in the street just to shake his hand and thanked him. "You don't know how long we've been waiting for someone to stand up to her," one woman said, her eyes full of relief. Another neighbor laughed and told him, "You're a legend now, if everyone's talking about what you did." Michael only nodded, trying to stay humble, but deep down, he felt a quiet pride. He hadn't planned to become some kind of hero. He just wanted peace. But sometimes, standing up for yourself gave courage to everyone else. Karen, on the other hand, was a shadow of her former self. She still walked the streets, but the arrogance was gone. People didn't greet her anymore. They avoided her eyes. Even the HOA board, which once jumped at her every complaint, now kept its distance. The loud woman who once ruled the neighborhood with her constant demands and threats was now ignored, laughed at, and treated like a nuisance. But Karen wasn't done yet. Her pride wouldn't let her be. One morning, Michael noticed a strange truck pulling into the neighborhood. It was a construction crew, the kind with heavy cutting tools. He watched from his porch as Karen waved them toward his workshop, shouting orders like she was the general of an army. The workers unloaded their gear, preparing to slice through the welded doors. Michael stood up and walked over calmly. "Can I help you?" he asked the crew leader. Karen spun around, fire in her eyes. "Yes, you can help by staying out of the way. I hired them to cut open the doors. I'm getting my car back today, whether you like it or not." The crew leader frowned. "This is your property, sir." Michael nodded. "Yes, my workshop. My doors." The man hesitated, looking from Michael to Karen. "Ma'am, if this is his property, we can't cut anything without his permission. That's destruction of private property. We could get in serious trouble." Karen nearly exploded. "Do you mean you can't?" "I'm paying you." But the man shook his head. "Sorry, lady. Money's not worth jail time. If this is his building, then it's his call." He waved for his crew to pack up. Within minutes, the truck was gone, leaving Karen standing in the street, her face red with fury and humiliation. Michael simply walked back to his porch, sat down, and sipped his coffee. He didn't need to say anything. Seeing everything, and the laughter that spread afterward was louder than ever. Eventually, the HOA had no choice but to step in. They held a special meeting, this time without Karen present. Too many residents had complained about her behavior, and too much attention had been drawn to the community because of her feud with Michael. The board sent her a letter. She was fined for misuse of property and warned that any further harassment of neighbors would lead to bigger penalties. Michael received a copy of the letter as well. For the first time since the whole mess started, the HOA was on his side. It admitted in writing that the workshop was his private property and no one had the right to enter it without his permission. Michael smiled when he read those words. After weeks of frustration, he finally had it in black and white. Karen tried to appeal the decision, but nobody listened. Even the other board members had grown tired of her. Without their support, she was powerless. Her SUV remained trapped in the workshop for several more weeks until finally, in desperation, she paid for professionals to remove the welded doors and replace them. The cost was high, and the humiliation was even higher. By the time she drove her car out again, it was covered in dust, a silent reminder of her defeat. Michael didn't stop her. He let her take it back once she had paid the price, both in money and in reputation. Watching her struggle, watching her admit defeat, was enough for him. Once the car was gone, he welded brand new, stronger doors on his workshop. This time he added heavy locks, reinforced steel, and security cameras. No, not Karen, not anyone would ever step inside without his permission again. Life slowly returned to normal. Michael reopened his workshop, taking on projects he had been forced to delay. Customers came and went. The sound of welding sparks returned, and the smell of steel and oil filled the air once more. Neighbors dropped by to chat, to watch him work, sometimes even to bring him lunch as a thank you. For standing up to the woman who had made their lives miserable for so long, Karen, meanwhile, kept to herself. She no longer marched around the neighborhood giving orders. She stopped attending HOA meetings, stopped knocking on doors, stopped filing complaints. Every time she passed Michael's house, she turned her head quickly, pretending not to see. Him, the woman who once strutted with pride, now walked with her shoulders hunched, her voice quiet, her power gone. For Michael, it was a victory not just for himself, but for everyone around him. He had fought not with words or threats, but with action. He had shown that no matter how loud or controlling someone tried to be, they couldn't take away what was rightfully his. The neighborhood was freer now, lighter, happier. People joked about the workshop incident for months afterward, retelling the story like it was a legend. And in a way it was. Sometimes when Michael sat on his porch in the evening, sipping his coffee and watching the sunset, he thought back to the moment he lit his welding torch and sealed those doors shut. At the time, he had been angry, desperate, and tired of being pushed. But looking back, he realized it had been the turning point, the moment he took control, not just of his workshop, but of his life. The best part wasn't the victory over Karen. The best part was the peace that followed. No more shouting, no more threats, no more HOA nonsense. Just him, his tools, his workshop, and the quiet respect of neighbors who finally saw him for what he was. A man who wouldn't be bullied. A man who stood his ground. And as for Karen, she never parked in his workshop again. In fact, she barely parked anywhere people could see. She kept her car hidden in her own driveway, tucked away like a secret she didn't want anyone to notice. The once proud, loud voice of the neighborhood was gone, replaced by silence. Michael had won. Not with fists, not with anger, but with steel, fire, and determination. And in that victory, the entire neighborhood found freedom.